There's another dispute among wireless carriers, but this time Verizon is at the center of the debate. The company is attempting to buy spectrum from Comcast, Time Warner, Bright House Communications, and Cox Communications for nearly $4 billion. The problem, however, is that many of the other wireless carriers, as well as public interest groups, believe that the deal would be harmful to competition. And several of these players, including T-Mobile, Sprint, Nextel, Public Knowledge, and the National Consumer Law Center, have filed complaints with the FCC asking that the agency blocked the deal. And Jodie Griffin, who is a staff attorney with Public Knowledge, is joining us now by way of Skype to talk about the proposed deal and the issues with it. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jodie.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Well, why are Public Knowledge and other companies against Verizon's purchase of spectrum?
Well, Verizon already is the largest wireless carrier in the country. So if we're just looking at the spectrum on its own, there's a severe problem with spectrum aggregation, that they're going to control too much of the spectrum to the detriment of smaller wireless carriers and to the detriment of consumers. And if we look at the history of this spectrum, you can also see that in 2006, the cable companies that are trying to sell the spectrum to Verizon right now purchased the spectrum for about $2.4 billion. And they did nothing with it. They sat on it for years. And now they're trying to sell it to Verizon for, as you said, almost $4 billion. And this is a problem because we don't know whether they intended to just not do anything with this valuable resource, or if they really wanted to join the market and failed. But if they intended to flip it for a profit, that is a problem, because that's just a terrific waste of a really valuable public resource. If they really tried to make an honest go of it, that's a problem, because it shows how highly concentrated the market is for wireless carriers right now, and how high the barriers to entry are for anybody who's trying to offer new competition. And it's also important not to forget that this is not just a spectrum sale. This agreement comes along with two other side agreements. Although you really have to view them as a whole to understand all of the problems that they pose for consumers. There is a resale agreement, an exclusive resale agreement between Verizon and the cable companies. So if you go to Verizon, you would buy your wireless service from Verizon, and they would say to you, would you like to purchase a Comcast subscription while you're there? And vice versa with the cable companies. And there's also what they're calling a joint operating entity, which is a joint venture that they're forming to develop new technologies that would probably have to do with integrating wireline and wireless technology. This poses a problem in a number of ways. And the main issue for the joint operating entity is that they will control some foundational technologies that are pivotal to the next generation of technologies for voice, data, internet services. And they're going to be able to veto any newcomers who want to come in and integrate with those technologies or offer new services that are compatible with those technologies, because the joint operating entity will own the patents exclusively, and they will be able to say who gets to use those patents and who doesn't.
Right. Yeah, I want to get into some of those issues in a little bit, but in the filing from the groups, Public Knowledge and the others said that the deal contradicts the 1996 Telecommunications Act. How does it do this specifically?
Well, when you think about the 1996 Act, Congress wrote that act at a time, what they were envisioning at the time was competition between the telephone companies and the cable companies. And it was going to be this great thing, and they were going to be rigorous competitors against each other, and it was going to benefit consumers because the competition would lead to new services, better services, lower prices. And that has not turned out exactly as we thought it might have in 1996. And now we're seeing, this is kind of a whole new step forward in this, that the telephone companies, Verizon Wireless, and the cable companies are just overtly saying we would not like to compete with each other anymore. And the result is that the whole structure of competition that the 1996 Act was based on is kind of falling in on itself. Mm-hmm. And this is going to cause a lot of problems going forward, because a lot of the law in communications law was written with the idea that we will rely on competition to provide certain benefits instead of heavy regulation. Mm-hmm. But if there's no competition, because the companies have just decided to divide the world between them, mm-hmm. then nothing's there to protect consumers and provide benefits to them.
Right. Well, do you think that it is at all ironic that T-Mobile is now pleading the same argument that Verizon did over the AT&T and T-Mobile deal that fell through last year?
I hate to say ironic. It is somewhat different from what they were arguing. At the time in the AT&T Mobile deal, though, I will say a lot of the speaking seemed to be on behalf of AT&T or Deutsche Telekom, which is T-Mobile USA's owner, as opposed to T-Mobile USA itself, which didn't have a whole lot in terms of an independent voice in that debate. But now I think you're seeing T-Mobile USA is a perfect example of a smaller competitor who is rightly so very upset about this transaction, because particularly in terms of the spectrum, as if Verizon acquires even more spectrum than it already has, remember it's already the largest wireless carrier, T-Mobile is going to be at a disadvantage, both in terms of being able to offer different levels of coverage to consumers and in terms of the deals that carriers make with each other to use each other's infrastructure and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, some internet companies have indicated that the long-term impact of this deal would not only impact the telecom industry, but also the internet industry, and could really become another net neutrality type of issue. Do you agree with this?
I don't think that's the worst, or it's not the most prominent issue mm-hmm. for this deal. But it certainly is always a concern. I think that it wouldn't be a bad idea, for example, that if the spectrum transfer goes through just on its own at the FCC, that they would condition the transfer upon a net neutrality condition, particularly for wireless services.
I see. Well, the issue of spectrum auctions was brought up in a payroll tax bill that was recently signed into law by the president. What impact does this law have on Verizon's deal?
When we're thinking about spectrum licensees and the authority that the FCC has over licensees, and the authority that the FCC has in terms of creating new auctions for new licensees and new potential competitors to wireless carriers like Verizon, it's important to consider things like the most recent legislation, because the most recent legislation is not as concerning as it looked like it was going to be at some points, but it does still somewhat constrict what the FCC can do in terms of the conditions that it can look at for who is eligible to bid on certain licenses and who isn't.
Right. Well, both the Department of Justice and the FCC are reviewing the deal between Verizon and the cable companies, but what are the chances of it being blocked or at least having certain stipulations added to it?
I think that there's a very good chance that it's going to be blocked. The Department of Justice, as you know, they're looking at this independently, and they are looking at it purely through an antitrust standpoint. As I'm sure you know, they just recently blocked the AT&T attempted takeover of T-Mobile, and that to me shows that they care about these issues, they're paying close attention, and they're not going to hesitate to step in and protect consumers when companies are behaving anti-competitively or considering behaving anti-competitively through these agreements that create a conference room for them to come in and make anti-competitive decisions in the future. The FCC standard, it's important to note, is higher than the DOJ's. The FCC will review it under the public interest standard, so they have to, the applicants, the Verizon and the cable companies, have to affirmatively show that this transfer and the agreements are in the public interest. Being neutral as regards the public interest is not enough, and harming the public interest is obviously not enough.
All right, well, we'll watch these proceedings closely. Thank you so much for talking with us, Jodie.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, and stay tuned to WebProNews for the very latest in this matter. I'm Abby Johnson with this report.